Today is Saturday, November 6th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today I'd like to talk about a topic that I've been chewing on for a while that I think will be helpful to Catholic parents and especially Catholic homeschooling parents. I'd like to propose a question, and then I'd like to respond to that question in the format of a disputation, which I think will be helpful for this discussion. The question, well, let me before I state the question, let me say what prompts me to take up the question in the first place. I'm a homeschooling Catholic father. I've worked in education full-time for over 20 years. I've worked with thousands of students, hundreds of Catholic parents, and one of the challenges that Catholic parents always face is that we want to raise our children in the Catholic faith. We want to fulfill our Catholic duty to our children, and yet very little is ever said or taught about what exactly that duty is and whether or not our success in fulfilling that duty can be measured in some way. And this is an important concern because as parents, we need to know, we need to have a goal. We need to understand what the end of Catholic parenting is, so that we can have a sense that we've accomplished it or that we haven't yet accomplished it and still have more work to do. We need to know, though, what our duty is and whether we've fulfilled it. Aristotle explains this in the Ethics when he says that to understand the end of a thing is to have a mark at which to aim. We want to have a mark to aim at. We want to have some measurable objective for our children's sake, but also for our own sake. And there are obvious reasons for this. First of all, we want to know what we need to do, what we're supposed to do, what our children need us to do, what the church expects us to do as Catholic parents. We also want to know that we've done it, because if one of our children choose as adults to abandon the faith, we're going to be tormented with guilt unless we can be sure that we fulfilled our duty and our children's departure from the faith is simply their own poor decision. We want to know whether we've done our job, because that affects how we should proceed if such an event were to occur. If I know that my son was well catechized, well raised, provided with everything he needed for success, that I set a good example before him, that I was faithful in my own duties as a Catholic, and then irrationally, inexcusably, and knowingly, he chooses to leave the faith, I want to know that this is his free choice and not a consequence of some failure of mine, that I may still have an opportunity to correct. And so this question is very important. The question is whether the reception of the sacrament of confirmation marks the fulfillment of the duties of a Catholic parent. I'll restate that. Whether the reception of the sacrament of confirmation marks the fulfillment of the duties of a Catholic parent. This is what's called a controversial question, and what that means is that there can only be a yes or a no answer. Whether the reception of the sacrament of confirmation marks the fulfillment of the duties of Catholic parents, yes or no. And in this discussion, as far as my response is concerned, I'm going to take the position that yes, when the sacrament of confirmation is received by a child, that marks the fulfillment of the Catholic duties of that child's parents. And in this talk, I'd like to prove my position. Before I do so, I'd like to make a couple of qualifications. First of all, I am aware that in some Christian circles, in some traditions, the sacrament of confirmation is given to children early in life, even as infants. Those traditions are not a part of the Latin Rite or of the Roman Catholic Church. And as I'm talking as a Roman Catholic and intending this message to be heard by Roman Catholics, I'm not interested in the practice of granting confirmation to infants or young children with the sacrament of baptism. And so that's irrelevant as far as my response is concerned. Secondly, it's possible that adults can seek confirmation in the Catholic Church independent of their parents, or even in spite of the lives and work of their parents. And I'm not saying that the reception of the sacrament of confirmation justifies anyone's parents, especially when those parents have nothing to do or very little to do with the adult decisions of their children. And I offer myself as an example of such a situation. I was raised in an unbelieving home. I was not brought to church. I was not brought and prepared for the sacrament of confirmation as a child. I became a Catholic when I was 30 years old, and I pursued the sacrament of confirmation as an independent adult, far removed from any influence of my parents. And I'm not saying that my reception of the sacrament of confirmation somehow goes back and approves of anything that my parents did or didn't do. So I'm not talking about the spiritual or sacramental lives of adults, and I'm not talking about those traditions where confirmation is given with baptism to young children or even to infants. So both of those situations are irrelevant. My answer to this question, whether the reception of the sacrament of confirmation marks the fulfillment of the Catholic duties of parents, is based on a situation where Catholic parents are raising their children in the Catholic faith and are teaching them and training them in the normal order of sacraments in the Church, leading from baptism to confirmation. And I answer that the reception of confirmation marks the fulfillment of the duties, the Catholic duties of those parents. Now, a couple of objections, or one objection that I can see being raised that I'd like to anticipate, is for someone to point to Saint Monica and show us an example of a mother, and not just any mother, but a saintly mother, chasing her adult son around the Roman Empire in the 4th century, agonizing over his spiritual life. And some may point to Saint Monica and say, Saint Monica is a model of a Christian mother. And that's how Christian mothers or Christian parents should act, because their duty is never fulfilled. Their duty is never fulfilled. And I'd like to reject that objection, and I'd like to do it up front before I even get into my actual response, because I think it's irrelevant. And I think many people speak of Saint Monica before they've had the opportunity or taken the effort to actually learn the details of the life of Saint Monica. Saint Monica does not fit the description of the parents that I gave a few minutes ago. I said that I'm talking about children being raised in an ordinary Catholic family where the mother and father are Catholics, and they are working to raise their children in the Catholic faith according to the normal order of events in the Catholic life and in Catholic family life. Saint Monica doesn't fit that description. Saint Monica was married to an unbeliever. Her son, Augustine, was raised in the home of an unbeliever as an unbeliever. He was given a classical but not Catholic education. He was trained in the liberal arts. He was trained in classical philosophy, but he was not raised to know or follow the Catholic faith. When Saint Monica was chasing Augustine around the Roman Empire in the mid-300s, she was chasing a son who was not baptized. She was not working like a Catholic mother, trying to call a son back to ordinary church life. She was working to call an unbeliever to baptism. She was doing the work of evangelization and not the work of ordinary Catholic parenting. She did not raise Augustine to be a Catholic, and as I said, his situation and Saint Monica's situation doesn't apply to the question at hand. Of course, there are all kinds of extreme and isolated circumstances, but I trust that everyone understands what I'm talking about when I say a normal Roman Catholic family raising their children in the Catholic Church, what we might call cradle Catholics. Now I answer, yes, the reception of the sacrament of confirmation does in fact mark the fulfillment, of the responsibilities of Catholic parents. And there's a number of reasons why. First of all, the Church teaches parents what's expected of them in ordinary parish life, and we can learn this in parish life, or we can learn this from the study of the Catechism. As parents, when our children are born, we're told that we should bring them to receive the sacrament of baptism. We're told that at baptism, our children are received into the church, that original sin is washed away, and they are made to be children of God, children of the church. And it's assumed and prayed for that they will grow in the church, in grace, and in the Holy Spirit as they go through their formative years as children in a Catholic home, as students receiving a Catholic education, and so on. Yet at the same time, it's acknowledged that the inclination to sin remains in them after baptism and throughout life, and that they remain free, that they have free will and must, for themselves, choose to follow Christ in order to merit eternal life. And that this expression of their free will is not expected at birth, nor during their early years of life, when they are said to not have reached the age of reason, nor even in the years shortly after that point of coming of age, but as they enter into adulthood, which is why the sacraments of First Reconciliation and of First Holy Communion are offered to them when they come into the age of reason, but the sacrament of confirmation is reserved for the time when they come to the end of their childhood and enter into adulthood. Confirmation is normally received by children who are 15, 16, 17 years old. Now, in American society, we often have kids living at home and depending on parents into their 20s, just because of the way our society is structured. But humanly speaking, personally speaking, biologically speaking, children have reached full development as they get into those mid to later teenage years. And we see the rules and laws in our country reflecting these things. For example, compulsory education laws in many places end at age 14, in some places at age 16. And it's understood that kids at that age can be getting to full-time work, that their childhood has ended. Girls are physically capable of becoming mothers in their early teens. And this is the time when the Church offers the sacrament of confirmation to our children. And this sacrament is considered a sacrament of initiation or introduction to the Catholic life, to the Catholic Church. But baptism was also a sacrament of initiation. And therefore we see that something must be different about this second sacrament. The first sacrament of initiation introduced an infant, unreasoning and nearly unconscious child into the Church through baptism, where the parents and godparents pledged to raise this child as a disciple of Jesus Christ within the Catholic Church. The child was offered the sacrament of First Reconciliation and of First Holy Communion, and welcomed into the communion of the Catholic Church, free and able to receive the gifts of absolution and of the graces of the Eucharist, starting around age 8 through the time of confirmation. As the child growing up in a Catholic home approached the age of confirmation, the pastors of the church got to know the child, got to know the family, and welcomed the child into a faith formation program through which he was prepared for the sacrament of confirmation. And this preparation includes a number of important activities and steps. And I'll just give you the details of our own parish. First of all, for children to be considered for confirmation, they must attend Mass in our parish. Our children are required to be present at Mass every Sunday. Not once in a while, not just when there are faith formation classes. Our children are required to be present at Mass every Sunday. And that presence at Mass is largely the work of parents. And so, in actuality, this first requirement for confirmation is that we, the parents, bring the children to Mass every Sunday. That's for us to do. Another requirement for confirmation in our parish is that the children have to complete the study of a packet of information that covers all of the basic doctrines of the Church that are considered to be necessary for the reception of confirmation. And that's our job as parents to teach the children. We have the option either of bringing our children to the parish faith formation program, which we have to pay for and provide the transportation and support for, or to teach the children and prepare them ourselves. So either way, the parents have work to do to prepare the children for confirmation. The children are then examined in this content. There's memory work that needs to be completed, questions asked, and the child faces this examination, and the child has to provide satisfactory answers and prove that he has in fact been instructed in the teaching of the Catholic faith and has learned it himself. That's not going to happen without the work of those parents. Then there are other activities. In our parish, there are service hour requirements. Our children are assigned a number of hours, and they've got to complete different types of service work in the home, in the community, and in the church. At home, for example, the children are required to perform tasks for their parents that are outside their normal range of activities. And this, of course, marks the children's obedience and shows that the child's relationship in the home, at the domestic level, is in good standing. And so we assign some projects for our children to work on, or our children go to their grandparents' house and do some work for their grandparents, and this is to fulfill their requirements for family service hours. Then they have community service hours, and there are a number of options presented to them by the church, which the church coordinates with local businesses or social services like local homeless shelters, crisis pregnancy centers and things like that, where they have to go and offer to do some volunteer work and fulfill a certain number of hours learning about these different institutions and activities in our community and having a chance to participate in them so that they can prove that they're aware of what's going on in our community as regards social justice and community life. And then thirdly, they're required to provide some service to the church. Altar service fulfills this qualification, but there are other opportunities throughout the year where confirmation candidates are invited to come and fulfill their service hours, helping with cleaning and maintenance at the church, and things like that. So the children are expected to show themselves aware of their duties towards their families, their community, and to the church. And all of these tasks require the involvement of the parents. It's a lot of work. When we've got a child in his last year of preparation for confirmation, it becomes a central focus of our weekly schedule, what's going on for confirmation prep. And then finally, these children, which have grown up in the presence of their parish pastor, are finally approved and recommended to the bishop for the reception of the sacrament of confirmation. And the bishop, representing Christ himself, for where the bishop is, there also is Christ, as the church fathers taught, comes and receives the child in this second sacrament of initiation, where the child is not presented by parents or by godparents who make promises on behalf of the unconscious child, but the child himself or herself makes these promises, repeats their baptismal vows, and says, "I believe," with their own lips, and hopefully with their own hearts. And when the bishop grants this grace that's dispensed through the sacrament of confirmation, the church marks this individual as having been trained in the Catholic faith, having been taught, having been led in discipleship, and the child is received as an adult member of the Catholic Church. And that's always emphasized in the homilies given at confirmation ceremonies. And so there's a testimony on all sides, from the parish pastor to those involved in faith formation and examination, to the community in general, to the bishop himself, that this child has been sufficiently taught and prepared for adult Catholic life. And that is the Catholic duty of parents. That was the duty that the Catholic parents promised the church when that child was baptized. And when that same child is received 15 years later for confirmation, the Church confirms that the child is in fact a Christian disciple and voluntary member of the Catholic Church. At that point, as I said, the parents have fulfilled their Catholic duties. And I believe that parents who have done so, who have worked to train their children, to teach their children, to lead their children in the participation in the sacramental life, to initiate them into the parish community, have done what was required of them, have done their duty. Now, some may have done so more effectively than others. Some may have done so in an extraordinary manner or to an extraordinary degree. But the sacrament of confirmation says that everything that is necessary is present. And therefore, it's as if the minimum requirements, that is, the duties of Catholic parents, have been fulfilled for this child. He may not know everything. He may not be Dominic Savio, but he knows everything he needs to know. He's experienced everything he needs to experience to now make his own choices as he enters adulthood. But he cannot claim that no one taught him, that no one helped him, that no one told him, because all of that formation was examined, approved, and confirmed in the sacrament of confirmation. And I believe it's necessary for all Catholics, all Catholic parents who have raised their children in the Church from baptism to confirmation to be able to rest assured that the Church has recognized their duty to have been fulfilled. Now, there may be much more work that needs to be done, and there is much more for parents to do outside of their Catholic duty. But to know that this part of their duty has been fulfilled, I believe is very important, especially at this crucial time in the children's lives. And the reception of the sacrament of confirmation, the approval of the child for the reception of the sacrament, is a mark for the Catholic parents that their child has been provided with sufficient knowledge and help to make choices regarding his own adult life and worship. And they have fulfilled the duty of making disciples in their home. As I said, there may be a lot more to do. We may still have to help our children to prepare for adult life and participation in a complicated modern marketplace where they need to earn a living, to be able to work honestly, to provide for themselves justly, and so on. There may be much more work to do as parents. Even spiritually, there may be much more that we wish to teach our children. There may be much more that we wish to show our children. We may continue to need to accompany our children as they enter into adulthood and help them through the difficult decisions of their lives. But that's different work than the essential duties of Christian parents. And I believe that when Christian parents know that their duties have been fulfilled, when Christian parents know that their duties have been fulfilled, they can then enter into those other works with a proper spirit, a positive, confident spirit that's necessary for those other works, and not live with this uncertain confusion about whether or not they've done their duty, especially as the child begins to make decisions for himself, some of which may be bad decisions. Those decisions should not be a source of guilt in the parents, because the child has no excuse. The child's choices were not owed to ignorance or some lack of formation. That's proven by his confirmation. These decisions are willful, possibly ignorant, but still willful decisions being made by an adult child. And they are not the parents' responsibility. They are the child's responsibility. This becomes official and legal at age 18. But just because it becomes official and legal at age 18 doesn't mean that that's when the child's responsibility becomes real. That's simply where the child becomes directly accountable to the law. And the law protects society from a child, or from an adult, I should say, who does not listen to the law of his household. The state, as far as the enforcement of law is concerned, enforces the law of the Christian household, and if a child will not obey his mother and father, if the discipline of the household proves to be insufficient for him to lead him to proper behavior, then the state steps in and enforces the law by force, and either begins penalizing him or physically removing him from society. And that testifies to the reality that this person is no longer the responsibility of his parents, but is personally accountable for his own choices. And these choices that are made by an adult child should not burden parents with guilt as if they were responsible, especially when they can offer up marks to prove that their duties were fulfilled. And parents have to be very careful with these situations, because they can play all kinds of games in the minds of parents, and usually, as parents are suffering through bad experiences because of bad decisions of their children, they still have younger children to raise. And they can't allow the bad decisions of an older child to ruin their relationship with their younger children, or deny those younger children the attention and instruction and support that they deserve, which are the parents' duties to those other children. And that's why this question of whether the reception of confirmation marks the fulfillment of the duties of parents to a child is so important, I think. The child has been provided with everything he needed, and he now chooses to build on that formation or to abandon it. And if we read the end of Romans 1, God says that unbelievers in the world are without excuse, because what can be known of God has been made known to them, for God Himself has manifested it to them through the created world around them. And I want you to follow me on this because I think this is important. In Romans chapter 1, at the end of the chapter, I encourage you to read it, beginning at verse 15 or so, down to the end of the chapter. God says that the unbelievers in the world do things that are evil, and they do so without excuse, because the knowledge that they need to do what is right is revealed to them by God in the creation of the world. And therefore, when they choose to act contrary to nature and do things that are evil, they know, as St. Paul says, that those who do them are worthy of death. It says they not only do them, but approve of others who do them. And he says that such people are inexcusable. They have all the information they need to make good choices, but they choose to make evil choices. And if that's true for unbelievers, that the knowledge available in creation is sufficient to make them accountable for their choices, how much more are the children not only raised in Christian homes, but confirmed by the church to know what the church teaches, accountable? How much more accountable is an adult raised in a Christian home and confirmed in the Catholic Church for decisions and choices made in adulthood? These choices, these decisions are no more the fault of parents than they are of God Himself, or the birds, or the clouds, or the sun, or the trees. The decisions made in adulthood are the adults' choices. They are the adults' responsibility. And parents need to be very careful not to beat themselves up over those decisions. Nature takes away all excuse. How much more Catholic parenting, Catholic family life, Catholic sacramental participation, the Catholic sacrament of confirmation in such a situation, the parents have fulfilled their duties. And while bad decisions of adult children may grieve parents because they wish for the best and they want their children to be holy and close to God, the Proverbs teach that a wise son makes his father glad. They want their children to be wise and happy, and therefore, of course, they're going to be grieved by adult children who make bad decisions. But they cannot allow themselves to be blamed for those decisions, either by those children or by others or by themselves, because that's not true. Their children had sufficient light to know what was right and chose what was wrong. And parents need to know that for their own peace of mind. They need to maintain their own spiritual life. They need to maintain their own spiritual devotion. They need to maintain their own spiritual disciplines. Not allow these things to eat at them and cause them to despise the devotions that they'll be tempted to think must not be effective because of the decisions of the older child. And you can see how the bad decisions of an older child can trickle down and end up destroying the whole family. But it's the duty of parents to not let that happen. And in order to prevent that from happening, parents need to make sure that they understand what their responsibilities actually are, so that if, God forbid, a child does choose to go astray as an adult, the parents will know that it is not their fault, that it is not a sign that the family life or their spiritual life is problematic, but that that child has made bad choices independently. And just remember, the life that you're living led a child to receive the sacrament of confirmation from a bishop of the church. That's what you should focus on, and not allow yourself to be discouraged. Now, having said all that, I'd like to also encourage parents a little bit, because I think it's going to be common for Catholic parents in modern society, especially American society, to see children enter into adulthood and fall away from the Catholic practice that they were raised in as they begin their adult lives. I believe it's going to be common just because of how our society is arranged. Our society expects college attendance. And college attendance is very demanding, and it pulls our children in a number of different directions and places great stress upon them, stress that's temporary. Temporary because it's only during the semesters for the duration of their college studies, and then it all ends. College years are very stressful the way that they're set up. It's 4 or more years of intense study, great financial pressure, great social pressure, not even negative or evil pressure, but just pressure to participate in a community life that's not necessarily oriented around spiritual devotion, and it's temporary. It's temporary. I think parents have to avoid reading too much into the wandering of an 18 to 22-year-old child, but realize that many of the influences in the child's life at that time, many of the distractions in the child's life at that time are temporary. And while I think the children need to be encouraged to do as well as they can, at the same time, we have to realize that the children are under a lot of stress and live in quite a bit of instability and uncertainty during these times. And so, spiritual wanderings and things like that are going to be expected. So, don't read too much into the behavior, into the words of an 18 to 22-year-old child. The child's under a lot of stress, and I think the best thing parents can do during those years is to maintain their own spiritual life, support the children as they go through those stressful years, help them as much as possible, encourage them to not be anxious, encourage them to work hard, to be patient, to trust in God, to pray, and keep reminding them of the need to focus on God. Encourage them to go to Mass, invite them to Mass if they're home for a weekend or on break for a time. But be positive, be encouraging, be comforting, be supportive. Because all of those distractions and stresses are temporary. I think if you maintain a positive attitude, maintain your own devotional life and warm, happy home environment, the children in the world, going out into the world to do their things, are going to know, like the prodigal son knew in the gospel, that their father's house is the best place. And they're going to want to go back there. And they're going to know that they've made mistakes. They're going to look back with regret and know that they could have done this better, they could have done this better, they could have avoided that bad decision. But that's all in hindsight. And if we're not hypocritical, we'll remember that we made the same kinds of mistakes, not out of any kind of ill will or atheism, but because life was simply stressful and confusing during those years. And those years come and go. The stresses of those years pass, and we settle into our adult lives after all of that work of college and career preparation and transition is completed and things settle down. That time where we try to figure out what to do in the world, in my own family and relations, I refer to that as survival mode, where people are just unstable, uncertain, don't really know what's going on, and they're just scrambling every day to survive. Those aren't the days when we should evaluate people's spiritual lives. Those are just necessary evils that we have to work through, and many of us go through them at different times. When there's turmoil and trials or confusion, sometimes our spiritual lives are just scrambled. Look at what happened through all of the COVID craziness. That's not necessarily anyone's fault. And I know people will go crazy with their conspiracy theories and imagine that everything is strategic and intentional, but they're just insane people. Disturbances and trials come, They throw us all into confusion. And the question is simply whether we return to where we belong once the craziness settles down. You don't think that societies were turned upside down in the medieval world when there were wars and plagues? You don't think society was turned upside down? Of course it was. But the question is, when we're free to make decisions in peace, when all of the trial has ended, when the storm is over, when all of the distractions that come from outside of us calm down, what is it that we desire? And I think we'll find that as long as we haven't ruined our relationships with our kids and frustrated or overwhelmed them by heaping upon them religious stresses and conflicts during those times of stress and uncertainty, I think we'll find that our children do want to return to their father's house, as it was, like the prodigal son. They have a lot of lessons to learn. They have a lot of faults to discover. They have a lot of points where they're just not persuaded to be convinced of. And those lessons are learned during those years spent in survival mode. Now, of course, as parents, we'd like to say we don't even want our kids to participate in those years. We'd like our kids just to avoid all that and just focus on God and keep everything. But that's easy for us to say in hindsight when talking about someone else's life. Those are desires, those are ideals, but that's not going to be what normally happens. The church teaches very clearly that we as parents do not have the right to tell our adult children what they should do with their lives. And that's why we have to bear these wrongs patiently. That's a work of mercy. But we're not allowed to control our children's lives. And if our children are not doing what we wish that they would do, they don't have to. It's their own adult life. And they have to make their own choices. Some of them choices are going to be bad. And they're going to have the same opportunity to learn the hard way, do repentance, amend their lives that you have. They're going to have the same opportunities to learn by trial and error as adults, just like you did. Just like I still do. And we have to make sure that, first of all, we don't take those decisions personally. We don't think more of them or make more of them than we ought to. And we realize that during these years of early formative adulthood, our kids are going to do and say many things that they really don't mean. And we have to avoid overreacting. But just be steadfast and continue doing good, because we likely have other children still to raise who need our attention, who need us to be joyful and loving, not miserable and complaining and frustrated and despairing. And so we can't afford to react to these problems wrongly, because we have other duties to fulfill. So yes, I believe that when the sacrament of confirmation is received by a child, our duty as Catholic parents is marked as fulfilled, and the child is recognized by the Church to have everything he needs entering adulthood to be able to go forward in the knowledge of Christ, in the service of Christ and His Church, and that the decisions he makes after that are his own. And that it's important for parents to understand that and constantly remind themselves of that. I've mentioned at the beginning of the talk a few qualifications, so I'm not interested and I'm not going to respond to any objections that people raise concerning confirmation given to infants, which I think is irrelevant. And I would argue that this question and the answer to this question may actually question that practice. I can imagine that practice leaving parents with all kinds of questions. But the practice of the Roman Catholic Church to baptize young emerging adults, to confirm young emerging adults, I believe is a source of great peace to the parents of those children, and is a warning to the children that they're being given the sacrament of confirmation because they're judged to have been sufficiently trained for the Christian life. That's a warning to the children, and I wish that pastors would make that clear, that the priests at those confirmation ceremonies would make that clear, that this is a warning that you have everything you need, and you're in a small number of people on earth to whom God has given such privilege. To whom more is given, more is expected. Saint Monica, I explained, is not a model of a Christian mother in the circumstances that I'm concerned with this question. Her son was not a Christian. Her son was not baptized. Her family wasn't even Christian. Her husband wasn't a Christian. That's not a normal Catholic family situation. So that's my response to this question, whether the reception of confirmation marks the fulfillment of the duties of Catholic parents in raising their children for the Catholic life. I hope that's helpful. I look forward to objections that anyone has who listens to this, even if they're not your personal objections. If you may agree with me, but simply be thinking of objections, I'd love for you to share them so we can look at them and discuss them, because that'll be helpful. I'll be thinking of objections as well. Play the role of devil's advocate. And if you personally disagree with my response to this question, if you personally disagree, don't respond emotionally. Don't simply respond over my response, because that's not appropriate. You can write your own response. You can present your own response separately. But if you're going to comment on the video or comment on the podcast and you disagree, what you should offer are very specific objections to specific statements that I made or arguments that I made, and I'll refute or respond to those objections. But to respond to a response with another response is not how disputation works. That would just go on forever unprofitably. If you disagree, you must disagree with a specific statement that can be proven false, or with a specific argument that you can prove is not valid. That's how you object to a response to a controversial question. So if you'd like to do that, whether it's your personal opinion or whether you're simply playing the role of the devil's advocate and want to take up a contrary opinion and make an objection, remember, the only appropriate response to a response is an objection to a specific statement or a specific argument or conclusion that's drawn from other statements. And you'll see in the comments, people may respond just with their own, that's just nonsense, and I'm just going to delete those and ignore them because that's not an appropriate response. So I hope that's helpful. I'd love to discuss it further. Hopefully this will open up some new issues, new questions for us to go deeper and improve our understanding as we seek to be the best Catholic parents that we can be. God bless.